Okay, good morning to those who are watching the recording or evening or whenever it is that you're watching it. The recording has started, and I'm going to share the screen with one of our texts. Give me a moment. Actually, let's go back. Okay, larger, good. Everybody can see the text. Okay, so we can begin. Last week, we were finishing that question about a sex offender in the synagogue where the Reform movement issued a teshuvah because they had a question literally about what they should do as far as both allowing the sex offender who was a minor, had been convicted and had served, quote, his time back into the synagogue, and the question of whether the uh, victim's family, which was also members of the synagogue, whether they could, the mother of the victim felt that she was not, did not want to be around the mother of the perpetrator. Now, after we looked at that, I took a number of other uh, policies. We looked at the policy of the Orthodox movement. They have an official policy. We looked at the policy of a church as to how they might handle allowing a sex offender back into their community. And I also brought this, which is from the new code of conduct that only about a month ago had been finalized. The Rabbinical Assembly was very cognizant of some of the issues that have occurred with sexual harassment within synagogues, where clergy have been involved or clergy have been whistleblowers, and they hired an outside firm. They created a committee, and they came up with a policy. Just about a month ago, they finally sent it out to all the members of the Rabbinical Assembly. And I pointed out that in our case, there is a paragraph that would be applicable. It's a very long document, but this particular paragraph of the document, as you can see, regarding child sexual offenders, and it said an RA member must not knowingly allow anyone, whether a minor or adult, who has been convicted or who is under active investigation for a sex crime against a child into their synagogue or organizations, if there are any children who may be present. Now, that was similar to one of the conclusions. Remember that reform movement, the Shuva, we had one conclusion. The main conclusion was that the offender should not be allowed into the synagogue, although there was a dissent. And there was a dissent saying that there might be certain types of circumstances, and even refer to the fact that churches sometimes do that. And we actually looked at a church policy, which basically was also quite lengthy. I think it was about 3 pages long, but essentially said that the offender had to be under supervision, going to counseling, and could only be in the church while physically accompanied by somebody who would follow and monitor that convicted offender's behavior. Now, here the RA saying, in cases where RA members are, well, this goes on, are not in the decision-making position, the rabbi must reach out to the RA to report steps that they are taken. In cases where such a person is permitted entry into the synagogue, notice that they don't say that the person is absolutely forbidden. What they say is that they right, must not knowingly allow anyone into the synagogue if there are children who may be present. That was the qualification there. And they also point out that truth of the matter is sometimes there are synagogues where the rabbi does not have full control over some rules. A synagogue is a classic example of what is officially called organized chaos, i.e., an organization where the lines of authority are not always clear, or they sometimes change. So that between the board and the rabbi and the president, who has the authority to make certain rules and to enforce them, they're pointing out there may be a situation where a rabbi wants to prohibit this child this child molester from the synagogue, but has been overruled, then they report to the RA that they wanted to implement it, but were not able to do so. Okay. I see you, Jack. Do you have your hand up? Do you have a comment? I know you had some trouble turning off your unmuting your microphone. So I know we saw your hand up last week. I don't know if you can you unmute your microphone? I'm not sure. Okay, you can't. All right. I'm sorry to hear that. But anyway, so let's go on. So those are the and those, so we have some questions about those things. Yeah, Rini, you're muted.
let's say let's say a rabbi tries to implement not letting someone into the synagogue and he can't do it and he reports to the rabbinical assembly. Do they have any authority over an individual congregation and
All
to
they can
apply
do
pressure?
that is in there, not to say that the rabbinical assembly can overrule, but that is there. So should there ever be any sort of legal issue,
uh,
and the rabbi is accused of not following through properly, the rabbi can say, "I tried to, but I was not able to." That's not a okay. I'm reaching out for you to you to change the policy. I'm reaching out to you to let you know that I tried to and I failed. And if anything happens, I got proof that I tried. You can't accuse me of negligence. Okay. So I wrote a letter to, actually, I wasn't sure who to write to. So I wrote a letter to both the executive director of the Rabbinical Assembly, and who is also the executive director of the United Synagogue. In other words, same person is the executive director of both the rabbinic organization and the organization of congregations. Organization of congregation is called the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. The rabbinic organization is the Rabbinical Assembly. Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal is the executive director of both. Just a couple of years ago, they decided to merge those two job titles. I also wrote it to Jay Kornsgold, who was president of the Rabbinical Assembly, not knowing for sure who I should write it to. So I got a very quick answer from Rabbi Blumenthal. But here was my question, which we raised in our class. I explained how we were talking about a sex offender in the synagogue and how we saw this. We were concerned with the phrase, if there are any children may be present. I was asked about how certain one can be about the presence or absence of a child in a synagogue, right? As we know, sometimes children are there and we don't even know. Sometimes a parent or grandparent brings a child to the synagogue. Sometimes the child wanders around the building, right? We often have rules, oh, you got to be in the religious school wing, but come on, guys, do you think that every religious school child is absolutely certain to follow that? I don't think so, okay? Also, is the question of a person who has a sex crime against a minor. The statement assumes that the person is a danger to children, but what about adults, right? I mean, it's true that the category was about sex offenders against children. It gets a little, but I do believe that's kind of blurry, right? It's a little blurry there. This statement assumes that person is a danger to children. What about adults? Should the synagogue be concerned about them? What about a parent whose child was the victim of the offender? Should that person be able to go to the synagogue without being in the presence of the convicted or investigated offender, right? The case we had here, the parent of the victim. I know that the guidelines can't cover every situation, but these are some raised in class. And then I said, finally, I can't find a clear United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism statement about this. All right, the RCA, the Organization of more modern Orthodox congregations, has a policy. As a matter of fact, when I searched for the policies, I noted that one of the things that popped up was that the congregation Darchei Noam, which some of you may know is across the street from the Congregation B'nai Israel Fairlawn Jewish Center, they have in their bylaws the word for word policy of the parent organization, the Rabbinical Council of America. But I couldn't find anything from the United Synagogue particularly. So I sent him a letter. And he was actually, I give him a lot of credit, busy guy, you know. He sent me an answer that night, last week. Excuse me. Hi, Ron. Thanks for reaching out. Normally, I pass it on to Cheryl Katzman. So I don't keep up with these things. I have no idea who that is. But she's in Israel and would not be able to respond for some time. Another member of the RA who's probably involved in this code. To my knowledge, the United Synagogue of Conservatism does not have a specific policy on this, though I expect this code will provide guidance for the movement as a whole, i.e., we have a policy that we send out to rabbis, which in point of fact covers a lot of areas, but the United Synagogue itself, to create a policy like this is an expensive and time-consuming process. That's why the Rabbinical Assembly only came up with it a month ago. And these issues were raised, I think, as we all know, beginning of both the Me Too movement and all of the scandals that have come out about rabbis and lay people and cantors and rabbis and so on. So it takes a long time, costs a lot of money, right? Let's understand that. Actually, I believe the Rabbinical Assembly got a grant to help pay for this. Okay. It might indeed be advisable for a convicted child sex offender to be completely banned from a community or congregation, right? We talked about that. He says it might be. And this policy does not preclude congregations from exercising such a ban. So he says, just because we say that we don't want them around if there are children present, the congregation could say completely, you're out, right? Which, by the way, was what the dominant position was from the Reform Teshuvah response. For example, when I was a public rabbi and faced this situation, we concluded that, in fact, we could not welcome such a person into our community. Okay, so he said, I had a real example where it happened. I offer personal counseling. Every Jewish individual has spiritual needs, but could not welcome that person into a communal space as it was not safe for children, and our adult participants also did not feel comfortable, right? So you have a child molester and he comes to services, the adults don't feel comfortable. I don't think that's surprising. I think that's a very real concern. However, some congregations have evaluated that it might be possible to welcome such a person into a Jewish community if it is safe to do so, i.e., because children are not present. Again, remember the dissent on that teshuvah from the Reform movement pretty much said that. This code allows for that discretion without making a recommendation, and it would certainly not be a requirement. So, for example, if there were community members who would be traumatized by that person's presence, parent of the victim, as we had in our previous case, I would assume a community would not permit that person's participation. In other words, he's almost talking directly to the situation we had in the Reform movement teshuvah about the mother of the victim who didn't want to be around the mother. Remember, not just the perpetrator, but the mother of the perpetrator. Finally, the code does not provide guidance on a specific danger to adults. Obviously, if there is a danger, access would need to be restricted or forbidden. I mean, that's another interesting question. This talks about children, not about adults, and for adults, it's a real problem. And he is saying access would need to be restricted. This provision is really to provide support to colleagues so they will be able to guide their congregants towards a safe and appropriate approach to child sex offenders. Obviously, there are additional cases that might require guidance, but not at the level of the code. In other worwords, I think what he's saying, actually, I wrote that back to him. Thank you for the prompt response. It is true there's a great deal of wise discretion that needs in these situations. Do you feel comfortable if I share your response to my class? I said to him, and he said, sure. And if they have any thoughts to share in return, they would be most welcome. So what he is saying is that we can't give you specific guidance for every single possible situation. These are the general rules. The congregations could be more restrictive. They don't have to be, but that's certainly allowable within this code. Okay, you saw what he said. Any reaction to his letter? Anyone? Yeah, Rini, and then Tammy.
It's okay.
I think he has the same issues that we have.
Okay,
You know that there's no one way to do it. So I think it's nice to know that the conservative movement, feels pretty strongly that someone who might harm children should be excluded, but we also ran into all these, questions that don't have concrete answers.
This right needs discretion. Okay. By the way, Siggy, good to see you this morning. So actually Siggy Westerman, who is just joined the class. Okay, yes, Tammy, your comment?
I was going to say he gives a broad stroke, which is good because I think he's really saying use common sense. And you can't have rules and regulations for every single situation.
Yeah.
Use common sense when you get them. And
I
when
think
you
use
have
common
that
sense.
situation, yeah.
And also, it might, affect exactly what did happen in your congregation, and different scenarios could be played out. We had the scenario in the reform movements where there was a member of the congregation who knew that her child was someone who would molest other children and allowed the child to become a camp counselor, right? Might that be different if the parent was totally unaware of her child's activities and was not aware to say to the congregation, no, he can't be a counselor, but just thought the kid was okay. So yes, there are a lot of different permutations, shall we say, and variations to these. Yeah, I thought he gave a good answer to some of the questions that we had. Okay. Any other comments or questions about this? All right. Good morning, Tammy. Okay, so so I guess the conclusion we've come to on this question of the sex offender is that congregations have some discretion. There's a strong feeling of exclusion for someone who has been either convicted or someone who has been being investigated. I mean, yeah, I wish Charlie's not here this morning. I remember Charlie was making the point that it is true that accusations can be made, which can later be proven to be false. But for the safety of the congregation, the idea was that exclusion was, I think a lot of us felt, a good option. And even if those of us here who felt that, well, exclusion may be too strong, there was clearly a sense, am I reading this correctly, that when we saw those rules and regulations that church put in effect, seemed reasonable, but the question was how much they can be fully implemented. Yes, the question was, okay, the convicted or investigated child offender could be admitted if they were going to counseling, they were under some sort of supervision, but they would have to, and even if they were under personal supervision on the church premises, there was still some feeling that even that might not be 100%, and that a congregation could reasonably say, even though we could say you can come back in with I forget the term they used in the church document, even if you came in with someone who's supervising you and watching you all the time, we're still not really 100% comfortable with you around the congregation. Fair enough? Okay. Any other final comments on this question of a sex offender in the synagogue?
Rabbi, is there any instance where there are specific steps that the offender must make in reaching certain goals, standards, which doesn't absolve the person of what they did, but makes them more acceptable to be readmitted?
Well, that was the question we were dealing with. Remember when with the reform movement in their teshuvah, they started by saying, yes, we believe in teshuvah. We believe that when people do something wrong, they can do teshuvah. And actually they listed some of the things Maimonides spoke about: admission of your guilt, apologizing to those you've hurt, and they even spoke in their teshuvah about some sort of public apology for the person who had been the offender. Uh, the question that I was raising, and I think was being raised in that teshuvah, was while we say in Judaism that teshuvah is always possible, repentance, and when you repent, it's it's basically wiping the slate clean, right? And they even statements that the person who does teshuvah is greater than the person who never sinned in the first place. Now, which is an interesting statement by the rabbis who were saying that a person who does something wrong and now is able to stop him or herself from doing that wrong again has shown some strength of character. Okay, we can believe that. The question though, with the child of with the abuse, and we looked at that definition from the American Psychological Society, is that the tendency towards child abuse is very difficult to fully erase, and that a person with that propensity can, without even though trying to stop doing it, it's hard to be sure, right? Again, think of it as an addiction. Again, I'm not a psychologist or a social worker, but if you think of it, it's like an addiction. The question is our understanding of some of the things that we don't want people to do. When we deal with the psychological questions, we recognize that they're much harder. Even if you would be, Maimonides says, if the person who sinned finds himself in the same situation when he sinned before and does not sin, that is an indication of teshuvah. But for us to say, oh, we have a child offender in the synagogue, so we'll see if he offends other children when we let him back in. If you molest a child molester in the synagogue, let's find out if he's done teshuvah by letting him in the synagogue, and we'll watch to see if he molests other children. Nobody's going to say, let's do that, right? So, Maimonides I think has a wonderful, you might say, okay, a guy who's got a gambling addiction can walk into a casino and just get a drink at the bar and then walk out. That's pretty good, right? But again, there's no third party who is being hurt in that situation, right? A person who is an alcoholic can be at a party where alcohol is being served and not drink. That's great. They've shown a degree that they've satisfied some of my Maimonides rules about teshuvah. But again, there's no third party we're worried about. Here with the sex offender, there's a third party, right? The victim, a very traumatic, type of behavior. So how do we know for sure that a sex offender is, quote, 100% cured? That puts us at odds with Maimonides. And I think that the reform movement was remember, they said he should be at the kids that should not be at the synagogue. There was a dissent. Remember that? One of the there was actually, let's go back for a moment on that. I may not have opened this up. If you can give me a second, we can do that. Have to give me a second. Open. Browse. There we go. Okay. Now, if you'll give me a second, I can get that up. 1 second. Share screen. Here it is. All right. Okay. This is the original text that we were studying, and you remember that they said between the two moral or religious values, right? The obligation takes precedence is to ensure our synagogue and schools are places of safety. So, as you ask, how do we know for sure that it's a place of safety? To what degree has the offender changed, right? The danger might be no less real, and it's reasonable to presume that the offender's presence would be deeply disturbing to his victim as well as to others. So here's not even a question of is he going to do the offense again, but is his physical presence Imagine yourself, you're in a synagogue and everybody knows that, Ploni Almoni, so-and-so has been convicted of a sex offense. How comfortable are you going to be with that person in your congregation? So it's not only a question, will this person do it again, but they're adding something, right? The congregation is therefore under no Judaic religious obligation to admit the young person, a convicted and hopefully recovering sex offender, into the grounds or into its programmatic activities. And it doesn't even say when there are no children present, right? I mean, there's some synagogues where there are children present a lot during the day. Somebody goes to evening minyan and brings his kid along, right? You've been there. So there was this dissent. Oops, where was it? A partial dissent, right? Where he said we could benefit from the experience of a number of Christian churches, which we looked at. The offender might be allowed entry and participation, restricted access, a requirement that the offender be accompanied by a family member or an individual, a prohibition of access. In other words, the whole series of things. So in answer to your first question, can we be totally sure that the offender, if he checks off the boxes of certain requirements, is no longer a threat? My understanding is that no, I don't think the psychological evidence from what I brought here, and I think it's here. There it is. Okay. The acts persist over a period of 6 months, several forms. Yeah, in other words, this does not mean we believe that a sexual offender cannot be successfully treated. It means rather that such treatment can be involved in difficult process, that its success can hinge on a number of factors. One such factor is the offender's desire to effect change. No evidence supports the notion that persons with paraphilias can be treated successfully without their cooperation. It's a hard one, right? Yeah. Carol? Gary, does that answer your question?
It does.
Yes, but I'm wondering, how would the congregation feel if someone was convicted of theft? A member of the synagogue steals during a service, let's say, from another member, is caught, says, "I'm sorry, I won't do it again." Are you going to keep that person as a member? They said, "Teshuva, I'm very sorry, I won't do it again." Perhaps they serve 30 days in prison. Will you allow that person back into your congregation? Or will you always be uncomfortable about having that person there?
Yeah, that's a good question. The person committed theft, you're saying?
Yeah,
Just to be
they
clear.
maybe they stole a wallet from a
Okay, they're a pickpocket. Let's be clear, they're a pickpocket. All right. And during services, they picked somebody who was carrying money with them into the synagogue on Shabbat. I understand there are people who do such things. And there's a pickpocket. Pick somebody's pocket, gets caught, serves his time or whatever it is, comes back. Do you want him back in the congregation? Good question. What do you think?
I think people will be uncomfortable, but then there's the question of teshuva.
Yeah. Again, I'm not a psychologist to talk about the kleptomania. Is that the term?
Yeah.
Or not? I may be using the wrong term. But it's a question that I think a synagogue has to debate as to whether they feel that the evidence of the complete teshuva is solid. And the problem is with certain addictive behaviors, it's an ongoing, lifelong struggle. Right? My understanding, again, of alcoholism, for example, is that it is a lifelong struggle. And those of us who are not addicted to things really cannot imagine the compulsions that people feel. So it's a real problem. I mean, Now, if the guy don't, what if the guy had only stolen, well, had stolen money from the synagogue? He was the treasurer
I'm
and he cooked the
wondering,
books.
I'm wondering, does the RA say it's okay not to admit him?
Well, we say it's okay not to admit the child offender, right? I don't think the RA has any specific rules about the thief. I mean, look, these are difficult questions. I mean, if the guy was, if could Madoff had, come back and join a synagogue, Jeffrey Epstein, would you feel comfortable in your synagogue with Jeffrey Epstein? I wouldn't. Why is that? Because the pattern was so disturbing and so long and so covered up. Even if he admitted he said he did teshuvah, I'm not sure I would want him in my synagogue. All right. Any other comments or questions on the topic? Yeah, I see Ed and then Rini.
Well, we've been talking about congregants. Where does the clergy fit into this?
Well, as you saw in the Rabbinical Assembly standard, they were saying the clergy should not, right? They should very clearly. Let's go back. We'll go back to two of these. Actually, there's one on. Okay. There's the clergy. Again, the clergy, the rabbi must not knowingly allow anyone who has been convicted or under active investigation for a sex crime against a child into their synagogue. Now here, right, and the whole question we've been talking about, if there are children who may be present, and I think a lot of people in our class, and frankly, including myself, feel that's if there are children present. So you allow them into comedy night?
I have to be more specific. I have to be more specific, Rabbi. Where the clergy is the sex offender.
Oh, if the clergy is the sex offender. Now
we've seen, I mean, I don't know
Yes.
about in the Jewish but I
Yes.
certainly know in the priests how it's been hidden and transferred and
it's happened, let's be very direct, it's happened to ministers and it's happened to rabbis. I will not name names, but I could. I remember asking there was one case where I said to one of my colleagues, how come this prominent rabbi went from a big congregation on the West Coast to the East Coast? And my response from a friend of mine was, don't ask. And typically on those sorts of things, it's usually some sort of major ethical violation, typically involving either money or sex. That's usually, I mean, yes, that happens. Now, the whole point of this RA code is that the RA has a vad hakavod. In other words, the RA, Rabbinical Assembly, has a committee. And if a rabbi or who's a member of the RA has been accused of certain things, you're talking about sex offense, and that has happened, then the vad hakavod, the committee of honor. Okay, it's kind of a euphemistic title, right? The committee of honor is entitled to investigate, and they can kick the rabbi out of the congregation, right? They can recommend steps that the rabbi has to take, right? Again, we're going back to Gary's question. How do we know? What if the rabbi was just caught, stealing money? And some rabbis have, right? What if the rabbi was caught, for sexual harassment, which many, unfortunately, rabbis have. There have been even cases, which I will not mention names, in recent years, there's just a recent couple of years, some very, very prominent rabbis have been accused of sexual harassment. And there are cases where their names have been removed from buildings, where people are questioning whether they feel comfortable singing the songs that that particular rabbi composed. and where that rabbi's name is no longer mentioned very often as it had been before, because they've realized there were serious questions. Now, again, the level of penalty is up to the Vad HaKavod. Of course, the rabbi can simply quit the rabbinical assembly, and they're no longer on their own volition, and say, I'm quitting the rabbinical assembly, I'm resigning. Then it's up to law enforcement, right, as well as the congregations to decide whether this should be pursued. But you are right in assuming that there are more than a few cases where it is swept under the rug. People don't talk about it. There are legal. I don't want to go into details, but yes, there have been legal cases where what do they call disclosure? What's the legal term? Where you can't disclose what happened, where a rabbi or a clergy person leaves the congregation.
Non-disclosure.
Non-disclosure. Thank you, Charlie. There have been more than, and I'm not going to tell you about them, but I do know of clergy people who left with a non-disclosure. If a person leaves with a non-disclosure agreement, it's not a good sign. And of course, typically with non-disclosure agreements, not only you cannot disclose what happened, you can't disclose that there is a non-disclosure agreement, right? That's my understanding. And unfortunately, there is a, shall we say, sometimes rabbis talk about these things, and there have been more than a few cases where that has happened. So in answer to your question, Ed, the rabbinical assembly can impose sanctions, can force the rabbi to exit the rabbinical assembly, or say, okay, you've got a problem, you've come to us, we understand your problem, take these steps, and we'll see if you can, again, it's a question. What was it? Is it habitual? Is it an addiction? How can you prove to the rabbinical assembly that you're going to follow the sanctions, and you're going to be okay? That's, and I know people who are on the Vada Kavod, but of course, that's totally, that I don't know about. That is absolutely totally confidential. So I have I don't know who's been taken up by the Vada Kavod, which again, this policy that I have here, which I've only given you two paragraphs from, very specifically talks about if a rabbi if it occurs a clergy person, how the Vad HaKavod will investigate. And this I do know. A member of the Vad HaKavod once said publicly, every month we have meetings, and every month I hope there's not going to be any new cases. That has yet to happen.
It seems to be not the same standard that we were looking at for a congregant, where they're saying that they should not be allowed into the congregation. Now with the rabbi, it seems like there's kind of not the same standard.
That I can't answer because I can't tell you for sure. My guess, can't tell you for sure, is that if a rabbi was convicted of, there's a difference between saying molesting a child, right, and sexually harassing or making harassing statements. This issue of harassment, I didn't really want to, I'm happy to go into this issue because I do have some texts on this. Are we interested in going into this question of clergy and sexual harassment?
That would be interesting.
You want, I
Yeah.
have some material on that. We can talk about that. Okay, maybe, all right. I wasn't sure whether we wanted to go there, but there have been cases of sexual harassment, and particularly they have increased because there are several issues here. There's the question of the clergy harassing other clergy, right? A rabbi harassing a cantor. And these cases have multiplied. Why? Because there are more female cantors and rabbis, and there are some, I don't want to sound sexist, but the reality is there have been male rabbis who have harassed female colleagues. Okay, if you'd like to talk, I'll bring some cases next week. We can do that. But there's a worse question, Ed, which you may want to think about. What happens when a congregant says to the clergy person, congregant A has been harassing me, right? I'm a person and I'm an adult. It is, oh, yes, it has been particularly clear in cases where women have been harassed by male congregants. What is the clergy responsibility there? Right? Right? See, they're just dealing here with two other issues, that the clergy has confidentiality, but RA members must report suspected abuse to the appropriate child protection law or enforcement agency. In other words, if I, as a rabbi, hear about child abuse, I have to report it. It's legally required, right? The rabbi requires any rabbi acting as pastoral counsel to a family where child abuse is suspected to consult with a licensed mental health professional and with a legal professional who has subject matters expertise. In other words, call a lawyer, talk to a lawyer to find out exactly legally what has to be done, if it has to be reported to the criminal justice system, and get a psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, somebody in the mental health area, because that's way beyond the competence of any rabbi who has not had advanced special training to deal with, right? We have those responsibilities. And of course, the other part is talk about rabbis, Ed. This is about offering honors, ritual and non-ritual, to individuals who have been convicted of heinous crimes as an adult and may convey tacit approval or support for the crimes that they've been committed. So what do you do? That's a whole other question. Do you give aliyot to people who have been committed? They're saying no. Okay. So I'm getting the feeling here we might want to go into that direction. Okay, we can do that. This question, because it has generally been raised with the issue of the Me Too movement and with more women who become rabbis, and that has occurred in settings that there has been press about that, and I have some of those. So okay, we can go in that direction. All right. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Rini.
Well, it surprises me. Maybe that's because I wouldn't do any of these things, but that a person who is convicted of a sex crime, let's go back to that one, would even want to come back to the same place where everybody knows what went on. I would think he would be embarrassed. And the same for a clergy. As a matter of fact, you and I both know a clergy person, a rabbi, who had an adulterous affair and committed suicide over it rather than face what the consequences in his congregation or his family. And that was very, very sad. He was a lovely man, but I don't understand how, especially a rabbi whom I hold to higher standards than other people, after they commit a crime, would even want to be in their congregation again, would even want to stay.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and you would think that might be true, but I am reluctant to say this, but I will. There are people who have no shame.
I guess, yeah.
There are people who have no shame and who commit acts, deny it, pretend it didn't happen, don't feel, there are sociopaths and people with no shame out there. Now, you don't have to be a total sociopath, but I think we have,
yeah.
Far be it for me to say that there are people in the public eye who have no shame, but there are people like that. Right. And we find it difficult to understand that, right? And as you point out, there are people who feel so much shame that they're unable to face it, right? So there's a continuum here. People who cannot face it and people who it doesn't affect at all. So the idea that you would assume a clergy person would not feel shame for doing something inappropriate. I'd like to think that happens, but as I've said, there are several cases I know of clergy people who abruptly left their congregations, and no one seems to know why. And that is often okay, one of these cases. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Tammy.
So what happens if somebody that was a convicted sex offender, that in New Jersey we have Megan's Law, and they do after their 15 years, they're off the registry. So they are allowed back in, when you're on the registry, you're not allowed within schools or parks or anything. But there are quite a few people now, since Megan's Law is old enough, that have petitioned to the courts to be removed from the registry. So they have to, do a certain amount of hours of therapy, and it has to go and be, they still have a felony. That doesn't go away, but now they're allowed to be in places where there's school. So would that person then be permitted to attend a bar mitzvah or a wedding? They're allowed to go into parks. They've been cleared legally, but would people still feel uncomfortable? And so then they're really, even for those few individuals that have done that significant amount of work, because there's a lot of work involved legally and whatever to be removed from the registry, still probably wouldn't meet these criteria. People would likely still feel uncomfortable. So even then,
Yeah, that's a great question and a very hard one, right? The
only
legal
reason I bring that up is I have somebody in my family, and I
Mhm.
had to make those decisions about my son's bar mitzvah and everything else,
Mhm.
because in the eyes of the law, that person has been cleared and lives their life and pays taxes and has been welcomed back in a lot of areas of the life. But when it comes to religion and all of that, where, how do you, or do you? I mean, obviously, I made the choice not to, but as being a social worker, I'm also held to a standard of advocacy. And so in my graduate classes, actually, they talked about this topic of sex offenders and the registry and all of that. So it brings into all these ethical things. Like if we continue to keep people away, we're almost saying like there's no chance to come back. And then if we do welcome them back, we can't promise that, we can't predict anything, and we can't promise people's feelings of safety. So like there really is like no real good answer. And I know like professionally and ethically and as a Jewish person and trying to do the right thing by everyone, like these topics, not just this, but other things, like there really isn't, But I have been somewhat, I don't know if accused is the right word, but been told like, how can you advocate for so many social issues and causes? And then it comes to these kind of areas and you'll turn your back on your own family. So it's kind of interesting, like, how do we choose like what
Right.
areas and people can't come back to? Irving Goffman, the sociologist, wrote about stigma. And there are, they say there are certain things that we do that we can't come back from. And,
Mhm.
if you hurt a child, is that one of the things you really can't come back from, is the stigma, and that no matter how many years you go, will always be afraid and never trust people. Or like the beautiful example, if somebody steals during services, no matter what they do, are you ever really going to be able to trust them? Or the person that drinks.
Right. Well, no, as everyone should know that Tammy is a trained social worker. And if correct me if I'm wrong, but what you are pointing out is that there is no clear, absolute answer to these questions. The legal system sets some standards based upon number of years and continuing supervision during those years of some sort, correct? And if you satisfy those criteria, the legal system says you're okay. But there is a difference between the legal system saying you're okay and two things I would think. One, psychologically, is it really okay? And I think you're saying, Tammy, we can't be sure. But for some people, they are okay, right? But we can't tell because we really can't look in, you can see them, but you can't look into them, right? So there's the question of, are they okay? And then the second question is, okay, if we're not sure if they're okay or not, what do we do? Do we still need to be protected and be in positions where we can be certain that there is protection against them because we're not 100% sure? And the answer is there are no easy answers to these questions. Am I reading you right, Tammy?
And I didn't invite them to any, I haven't seen them in over 12 years, and it's a painful kind of place to sit
Sure.
because, still a member of the family, and, but for public safety and for all those reasons that they said, like, I kept saying to myself, how would anybody feel if they knew that somebody at there, even if they had been cleared legally? It's a responsibility I did not feel I wanted to take on, that I'm able to take on. But the only reason I bring it up is because there is a whole other school of thought out there that the more that we ban people, the more we're setting them up to reoffend, and the more you keep people away, the more that they'll
Yeah.
keep hurting people. So
Right.
then that's a whole other thing.
Right. And I think you're saying both from the legal point of view, there is a frame where they're free of the offense, but from a psychological and personal safety point of view, that's a little bit more difficult to say.
And to
Okay.
get off Megan's law is a big legal thing to do, to have a judge remove you from the registry. There's only been, a handful of people since the law came in. So even with that standard of that high being met, how much more peace of mind or safety does that bring? And if not much, even that legal thing doesn't hold much.
Right. So you're saying that even when you may objectively meet some legal standards, still there is discretion in the legal system from saying, okay, even though it's 15 years and you went to the counseling, guess what?
Right.
We're still not comfortable, right? And you can stay on the list. So that's a tough one. Charlie, you were going to comment.
Yeah, I was going to say that, like, even with the mitzvot, we're told to save a life. That's the paramount thing. You must save a life. Well, what if saving a life would put your life in jeopardy and that of your family? I mean, we have these conflicts every day between the ethics and what the social worker should do theoretically, and what personally you're in a situation where you have to make a decision about your child. What do you do then? I mean, you have to, it comes down to individual choice. And that's why we need these kind of classes. It develops our ethical training, you might say, or experience, so we can handle these lifetime issues that we're all going to face eventually.
Right. I mean, again, if we take the ethical standards that we've looked at, where you make ethical decisions based upon, if we take two general areas, based upon it, there's a set of rules and you follow the rules and that's it, versus, well, we make ethical decisions based upon possible consequences, right? So if we take it on consequences there, we would say, well, I don't want to do anything that would cause harm. And I have to make those decisions based upon whether or not they will cause harm. That's the the very practical ethical area. But the stricter ethical area says you follow the rules. It's 15 years. You went to the counseling. Okay, the rules say that you're okay. So where do we go? And I think as we're all seeing, this is, and again, as I've said many times, sometimes the ethical areas issues are a bit gray. They're not always black and white. And there is definitely a great deal of what could we say, intuition, feeling, personal concerns that get into these ethical issues. And it would certainly be nice to live in a world where everything was clear, but that's not the world we live in. So as Tammy pointed out, you have to make decisions based upon what you see as the best way of acting based upon the information that you have. And in many decisions, you don't have all the information. You don't know for sure whether or not this individual is liable to commit the unethical acts in the future. Okay, yeah. Any other comments? Questions? All right, well, we're just about done today. We got another 5 minutes. But so what I could do, if you like, as I think you do like, let's talk about some sexual harassment issues that have occurred in synagogues. I have some articles about that. I will switch. I was intending to go to the next topic in Rabbi Barmash's book, which is about personal status. And the first one that she was going to talk about is about the mamzer. We'll get to that. We've been doing this for years. However long this takes. So what we will do is the issue, by the way, and when I say mamzer, just to be clear, that is not what we say in English is a quote bastard, a person whose parents weren't married to each other at the time of the birth. A mamzer is a technical legal term in Judaism, and it is a child of a quote forbidden relationship, i.e., typically either incest or the mother of the child was married to someone who is not the father of the child. But we'll get to that eventually, but not right now. Those of you who do have the book, you'll notice that that's the next section. So we'll put that off. Let me bring next week a couple of articles. Again, there are two issues here. Well, there are a lot of issues. One is, what is the responsibility of a congregation if a congregant brings forth a charge that another congregant is harassing him or her? How should a congregation react? Okay. Second question is talking very specifically about clergy. And this is also this is specifically, again, has happened to many women rabbis and cantors, because unfortunately, and this is just true, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, that there have been real cases of serious questions of sexual harassment of male clergy against female clergy. So how do you deal with that? So I got a couple of articles. Hadassah magazine had actually some wonderful articles about it, and there are some other materials about that. Again, those issues, we're dealing in a time where we can only be grateful that these are coming to the surface now. They certainly were hidden, or as I say, swept under the rug, or not taken seriously not that long ago. So that's a good positive part. But we'll see how certain clergy and synagogues try to avoid dealing with them head on, which is what we need to do. And I think we're in a better place. And again, it's just a month ago that the Rabbinical Assembly came out with this this whole code of ethics. So we'll go in that direction. Okay. Any other comments or questions before we finish? Yeah, Charlie, please.
Well, just a minor thing, but what is harassment? I mean, I think what is harassment? The idea has changed over years. And
okay, good
it's
question.
much
We
different
will
than it was
see. Good.
years ago.
That's a great question. What defines harassment? We will see some very concrete examples. In both there are two articles that I have in mind, which I've seen recently. We'll take a look at some very concrete examples of harassment, because unfortunately, sometimes you do have the perpetrators say, "Oh, I was just kidding. I didn't know." People would take offense at what I was saying. And that you sometimes hear as a defense. But that's a good question. And we'll keep that in mind as we look at the specifics of what has happened in these cases. Okay, any other comments or questions before we adjourned for the day. Well, good seeing you all. Weather's a little
Thank you.
warmer. You're welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Weather's a little warmer today in Fair Lawn. Hope so in
Not in
Ohio.
Ohio.
Yeah, well, what's good? What happens in Ohio eventually happens in New Jersey. What happens in Ohio doesn't stay in Ohio. Unfortunately so, as we know. Ben Franklin, I think it was the one who proved that the weather goes from the west to the east on the American continents.
My daughter tells me that.
Okay, it's true. Have a good day. See you next week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.